Okay, I think we're going to get started. I know that people are just joining us, but I think it's time to start the program. I'm Karen Maida Allman, and on behalf of Densho, the University of Washington Press, and the Elliott Bay Book Company, I'd like to welcome you to today's event. In honor of Women's History Month, we welcome Diane Fujino to discuss her book, Nisei Radicals, The Feminist Poetics and Transformative Ministry of Mitsuye Yamada and Michael Yasutake. In her book, Diane Fujino reveals a radical lineage of Japanese American activism through the lives of feminist poet Mitsu Yamada and her brother, the Reverend Michael Yasutake. Mitsu Yamada played a critical and foundational role in building the Asian American and U.S. Third World women's movements, and she also was active in working for support for political prisoners, which was also at the core of Michael Yasutake's activist life. This is also one of the few recent books examining the ways that faith traditions have influenced Japanese American activists, both Christian in this case, and also Buddhist in others. Like many, my first introduction to Mitsu's work was Invisibility as an Unnatural Disaster. And that was published in This Bridge Called My Back. And that was published by Kitchen Table Press. I'd never read anything like it, had no idea that there was something called third world feminism, but I knew that my people were out there somewhere. And actually, as Diane and I were discussing earlier this week, this article could have been written today. Later on, I learned that Elliott Bay Book Company, my bookstore, the bookstore where I've worked for the past 20 years, carried the original Shameless Hussy press editions of Camp Notes, sold to us by Mitsu herself, as well as later editions published by Kitchen Table Press and Rutgers University Press. And I was thrilled to learn more about her life and also that of her brother Michael, an Episcopal priest and activist. Our speaker today, the first one, is Diane Fujino. She's professor in the Department of Asian American Studies at the University of California, Santa Barbara. She specializes in the study of Asian American activism, Afro-Asian solidarities, and Black Power studies. She is the author or co-editor of two new books, Nisei Radicals, but also Black Power Afterlives, The Enduring Significance of the Black Panther Party, and the Amerasia Journal special issue on Asian American activism studies. Her earlier writings include books on Asian American activists Yuriko Chiyama and Fred Ho, and we are also glad to welcome her to Elliott Bay to speak about her book, Samurai Among Panthers, and this was her book about Richard Aoki. She's also a longtime activist organizer, including with the Ethnic Studies Now Santa Barbara Coalition and Cooperation Santa Barbara. Mitsu Mei Yamada is an acclaimed poet, essayist, educator, beloved feminist, and human rights activist. She was one of the first and most vocal of the Asian American women writers who wrote about the wartime incarceration of Japanese Americans. Her first two collections, Camp Notes and Other Poems, and Desert Run, Poems and Stories, are now available in the combined volume, Camp Notes and Other Writings. At the age of 96, she published Full Circle, New and Selected Poems in 2019, and we heard her read from that at a Densho event a couple of years ago. With a lifelong commitment to fighting for human rights, Yamada has served in the Amnesty International USA National Board of Directors, and she's received many, many awards, including a Mellis Award, a Vesta Award from the Los Angeles Women's Building, and a Jessie Bernard Wise Women Award from the Center for Women's Policy Studies. So the program today will start with a presentation by Diane Fujino. She will present on the book, and this will be followed by a videotaped interview with Mitsuye Yamada, and we'll finish the program with time for questions from the audience. Thank you, as always, to our partners at Densho for producing this and many other wonderful programs, including their blog, their website of oral history interviews, pictures, articles, curriculum, and so much more at densho.org, and also the podcast Kampu. I'd also like to note that funding for this event was provided in part by City of Seattle Office of Arts and Culture. Thank you everyone for joining us and for warmly welcoming Diane Fujino to our virtual stage.
Thank you so much, Karen. And I thank everybody who's out there in the Zoomiverse. I cannot see you, but I'm getting a few chats and welcomes and hellos. And it's wonderful to feel like we're in a community, a Japanese American community that supports the work of disseminating and shifting the narratives around Japanese America. I want to acknowledge that I'm speaking from Santa Barbara, California, the unceded lands and waters of the Chumash peoples, past, present, and future. And I also want to recognize the tremendously difficult moment that we're living in and the intensity of anti-Asian racism and violence, and our collective mourning for the Asian women in Atlanta and the targets of racist violence everywhere. My appreciation goes to Densho for their conscientious planning of this event and for their important work to document and disseminate Japanese American history. To Karen Maeda Allman and Elliott Bay Books, and we really need to support independent bookstores, and the University of Washington Press for not only publishing this book, but for their longstanding commitment to publishing Japanese American history. I want to acknowledge that Mitsue Yamada is in the audience along with her family. Welcome, Mitsu. Mitsue Yamada is at once an influential Japanese American poet and writer, and one who remains invisible in many ways. To those familiar with Densho, she is a beloved figure raised in Seattle in the 1920s and 30s, part of a prominent Japanese American family. And Densho has on its website interviews with Mitsu and two of her brothers, Tosh and Yosh Yasutake. And this program for Women's History Month is intended to center Mitsue Yamada and to do so by spotlighting Nisei radicals. This book presents an activist study and storytelling narrative of the lives of Mitsue Yamada and her brother, the Reverend Michael Yasutake. It is intended as a political biography with a heavy focus on their activist works for justice and liberation. And there's a great deal to discuss, and I have a short period of time. And what I'm going to do with my time tonight is to first frame the work that I'm trying to do with this book. And in doing so, I'll be able to talk a little bit about Japanese American history. And the second thing that I'm going to do is to focus on Mitsue's Asian American activism, which is an area that has received far less attention than her writings. And still, her writings are inseparable from her activism, and I will be focusing on both in this talk. This talk, as Karen noted, is intended to accompany the interview with Mitsue Yamada that follows next. Okay, so the book makes three major interventions that I want to highlight today. First, it expands our understanding of Japanese American history. In the book, I frame Mitsue and Mike's early years through the themes of loss and separation. Against the notions of linear movement from Japan to the United States, we see in the Yasutake family that the older brother was born in the United States in Seattle, and the younger sister was born in Japan. The Yasutakes, as you can see in that photo, were a family of means, with their father, Jack Yasutake, among the Issei, or Japanese immigrant elite. He attended Stanford. He held a professional job in a mainstream position, and he served as a community leader. Their economic status shielded them from some of the harshness of life facing the Issei, and Mrs. Yasutake's friends viewed her as a lady of leisure. Yet they could not escape the racism of the concentration camps nor other kinds of hardships. And there was a repeated pattern of family separations that in my formulation shaped the later politics and activisms of Mitsue and Mike. Mike was born in Seattle in 1920, followed by three more children. And when Mrs. Yasutake was 7 months pregnant with Mitsue, she traveled to Japan with her two young sons. She went to gain support from her own family, and also because Mr. Yasutake, who had to deliver his second son when the midwife was overburdened, decided that he did not want to have to go through that experience again. Shortly after Mitsu was born in Kyushu, her brother Tosh became gravely ill, forcing Mrs. Yasutake to leave Mike with his grandparents, and she had to find a mother who was nursing to leave her infant daughter. Mitsue ended up staying in Japan for 3.5 years. But when her grandparents refused to release their beloved grandson to the couple that Mr. Yasutake sent to Japan to escort them home, Mike ended up staying in Japan for another 18 months. When he returned to Seattle at age 7, it was as if he was joining the family for the first time. And to this day, Mitsu talks about when Mike joined the family at age 7, even though he had been born in Seattle. For Mike, the second separation, joining his family in Seattle at age 7, was harder than the first separation, right? Staying in Japan at age 2. He spoke throughout his life about how, having grown up in Japan, he felt alienated from both white culture as well as from Nisei culture. Indeed, right, he was a Kibe. This shaped his politics, where as an Episcopal priest and a fierce activist, he fought on the side of the oppressed. Second, in my work, I'm trying to disrupt the narrative of the Nisei, the dominant narrative. I assert that the Nisei became the archetypal representative of assimilationism, and in fact are seen as the most assimilationist of any Japanese American generation, and I would say of nearly any group. So the journalist Bill Hosokawa wrote this very influential book, right? And the Nisei, and subtitled The Quiet Americans. And this helped to propel, not by itself, but it certainly reflected and helped to reinforce an image that was developing about the Nisei, that they were quiet Americans, that they were politically passive, that they were assimilationists. And the cover on the left, the black one, is a bit tattered. And this reminds me of the copy that I now have inherited from my parents, which was on their bookshelves for many, many years. And the new one, the new cover on the right, shows also the influence of the Nisei soldiers, right? Their important work, but also the ways that the trope of the Nisei soldier really has shaped the ways that people view Japanese America, as well as the Nisei in particular. The move towards imagining the Nisei as assimilable was part of the work that rapidly and unexpectedly shifted Japanese American representations from enemy to model citizen. It's understandable why so many Japanese in the Japanese American community would welcome and value this shift and adopt these politics. My point, however, is that this didn't just happen by circumstance, but rather served geopolitical purposes. As the US emerged from World War II as the foremost world leader, it sought two contradictory goals. First, to portray itself as a champion of freedom, democracy, and equality, and thus needing to distance itself from old world colonialism, while at the same time expanding in the Asia Pacific region. Christina Klein in Cold World Orientalism writes convincingly of how and why the various Broadway plays, right, South Pacific and The King and I, and James Michener's novels suddenly portrayed Asia and the Pacific in a positive light. That new world order emerging in the post-war period required not exclusion, but the global imaginary of integration. In the post-war period, suburbs and colleges and jobs equivalent to college educations opened up for Japanese Americans, and the newfound opportunities was productive to enabling the US to claim its commitments to equality, even as it expanded its empire building in Asia. Mitsue Yamada and Mike Yasutake's lives were shaped by these conditions. They were never quite free from the imposition of assimilationism, even as they forged radical politics. Third, this book advances a case for progressive and radical Nisei activism. I'm going to run through this quickly, but I'm building in this book and trying to make visible the more radical and progressive forms of activism that contest this trope of Nisei assimilationism. So we see, right, Gordon Hirabayashi, Min Yasui, Fred Korematsu, who challenged evacuation and curfew all the way up to the Supreme Court. And we see on the right, the Japanese American draft resistors. This is the 63 draft resistors from Heart Mountain, who from places of vulnerability inside the camps refused to abide by the selective service based on their opposition to racism. And in the next slide, we see Asian American laborers, and there's a rich history of labor resistance. And the slide on the far left is a really powerful mural up in Honolulu of the ILWU strikes. In the middle, we see Yuri Kochiyama, a Nisei activist and radical who had deep connections to the Black Power movement and especially Malcolm X. And on the right is Bill Kochiyama, her husband, as he testifies before the congressional hearings for redress and reparations. And the local activist organization did a demonstration, and they put up different plaques behind Bill Kochiyama as he spoke. Mitsuo Yamada is best known for her writings. So in the early 1960s, after experiencing a life-threatening respiratory episode and being given the diagnosis of terminal emphysema, which clearly was a misdiagnosis, she was given a year to live, and she surprised herself at that moment with not devoting her energies to husband and children, but instead deciding to do the things that she always wanted to do, focusing on writing, teaching, and activism. She pulled out her poems that she had written inside the concentration camps inside Minidoka, Idaho. And while recovering in bed, she also read extensively, especially the works of white feminists. When she moved to Irvine in the early 70s, she got involved in two different kinds of writings. One, working with Amnesty International and writing to political prisoners of conscience throughout the world. And two, reading and writing poetry and literary works along with local writers. And it was through these literary circles that she met the feminist poet Alta, founder of Shameless Hussy Press, who invited Mitsu to publish her camp writings. This turned into Camp Notes, published in 1976, making it the first book by a Japanese American poet focusing on the issues of incarceration. And I should say that this was published at a time when the redress movement was quite controversial within the Japanese American community. Mitsu's touching poems were often written with an understated sparsity and a dry wit, and they reveal her reflections on the camps. In her writings, she often focused attention on the experiences and hardships of Issei women, right, the immigrant women. And through the process of critical self-reflection and writing, she came to see her own mother very differently. She had had a difficult relationship with her stern mother, who had imposed the norms of conventional Nisei femininity onto Mitsu, who rebelled. But as she listened to the stories her mother told her, and as she understood how racialized patriarchal structures impacted her own mother's life, she grew in her understanding, and this began to shift her relationship with her mother. Mitsuo Yamada further helped to shape the US Third World women's literary movement of the 1970s and 80s, sharing, reading, and writing with other women of color. And this Bridge Called My Back, right, this groundbreaking book by Sherry Moraga and Gloria Anzaldúa, Mitsu has two articles in there. The very famous Invisibility is an Unnatural Disaster and Asian Pacific American Women in Feminism. And when she writes, she talks about, she just has a way of reflecting critically, not hitting people on the head, but hitting the issue on the head. And what she writes about in Invisibility is the ways in which, when she spoke out with anger at a faculty meeting, she was teaching at a community college, her colleagues got so angry and said, "We would have expected this from Black or Chicana women, but not from you, an Asian American woman." Or how a student told her, "I didn't expect the anger of Asian American women because I didn't know they were oppressed." This is the workings of the model minority image, right, which renders racism and sexism and other kinds of oppression invisible within Asian America, something that's becoming more visible today in this very unprecedented moment of visibility for Asian Americans. In the next slide, we see that she also participated with other Asian American women, in this case with Merle Wu and Nellie Wong, and they published this 3 Asian American writers speak out on feminism. And there was also a really wonderful documentary made, Mitsue and Nellie, that focuses on life as a Japanese American feminist poet and a Chinese American feminist poet. Mitsu was also involved in helping to organize and attending the really influential National Women's Conference in Houston in 1977, and then coming to help to organize both the regional as well as the national Asian Pacific Women's Conferences in 1980. And this helped to really jumpstart Asian American feminism, and she was deeply involved in this kind of work and one of the most visible Asian American feminists. Before we turn to the interview with Mitsu Yamada, I want to note, actually, before I do this, I'm sorry, could you go back to the slide on the political prisoners? Because I want to note that Mitsu began to support US-based political prisoners. This was at the nudging of her brother, who was saying, you're supporting prisoners around the world, but not in the United States. And so she began to do this, and for her, not surprisingly, she began to support women political prisoners. And she visited them, making the trip to Dublin in Northern California, a 6-7 hour drive. She supported, here in this picture, Laura Whitehorn, Carmen Valentin, and Marilyn Buck. And Marilyn Buck was a poet with whom Mitsu formed an especially close relationship. And Mitsu also used her connections, especially in Amnesty International, to advocate for the release of the political prisoners. Okay, now for the last slide that I want to show, before we turn to the interview, I just want to note the ways that Mitsu, at age 97, continues to be really active. So we see the picture on the right with her daughter Hetty, and they went to a women's march when last year, and you see Mitsu right there, still doing her thing. And I want to end with showcasing this stunningly beautiful and sassy picture of Mitsu in red beret taken by Tani Ikeda. I think we'll turn now to the interview. Hi, Mitsu.
Hi, Diane.
Your father, Jack Yasutake, was a most interesting person. He was a Japanese American immigrant and Issei who came here in 1907, studied at Stanford, also did work that many Issei did, working as a domestic for a while, but was a very rare Issei who got a job in mainstream America, right? In his case, as an interpreter for the Immigration and Naturalization Service. And your dad was also a poet, and he met every Sunday with mostly Issei men to drink and eat and write poetry and read their Senryu poetry out loud. And can you speak to how your dad's engagements with poetry shaped your own writing?
Yes, I remember when I was quite young, I think by the time I was in high school, the poetry group they met the first Sunday of every month. And and then my mother would be making sushi in the kitchen and serving tea and sushi to the men while they were and my mother put all the dividers and they would make the kitchen table, the dining room table quite large, and all the men would be sitting around the dining room table. I think there were probably about 8 to 10 men, And I remember there was one woman who was sort of very unlike a Issei woman. She drank and she smoked, which was kind of a shocking, you know, and she talked like the men, you know, she was smoking and she kind of laughed out loud and she would throw her head back and laugh. And of course, you know, my mother never did that, you know, she was always cover her mouth when she was laughing in public anyway. My mother was very demure. And so she kind of fascinated me, you know, because she was kind of a different kind of Issei woman sitting, and my mother was serving. And the thing that always kind of impressed me was that my mother would be, she didn't mind serving the men, but she kind of resented the woman, this one woman sitting among the men. And she said, what is she doing here? You know, she should be home with her children, right? Instead of sitting among the men and acting like a man rather than a woman. And I think that kind of, that was when I was quite young.
Mitsu, can I ask you?
Yeah.
You know, you're talking about the hardships of the Issei, right, and immigration. And in your writing, you talk a lot about the hardship of Issei women.
Yes.
And your own relationship with your mom was tense in many ways, in part
It was
because
quite tense because my mother was quite strict, and she felt. I had two older brothers, right, Mike and Tosh, and they were much more free to do a lot of things. But then my mother was much stricter with me because I was a girl, and she said, "You're only a girl. You can't do this and that. You can't go out at night." And so, and I resented that quite a bit. And my mother was therefore the kind of a taskmaster. She was the one who made me cross my leg, not
right.
don't sit with my legs. I had this keep my legs, my knees together, and all of the rules about being a proper Japanese girl. And whereas my brothers didn't have to do any of that, right? So I really resented my mother for that, I think, because I was treated very differently from my older brothers. I had three brothers, two older brothers and one younger brother. And the boys were free to do a lot of things that I was not able, I was told that I shouldn't do as a Japanese girl. And even my language was different, right? That the boys could say boku, and they could, in the Japanese language, when you say kure, give me something, kure, the boys could say, whereas the girls have to say, will you please, I would really like to have, the language is very different. Watashi wa kudasai, kudasai, and then the Japanese language that we were taught was also quite kind of different, but but then it's cultural these days, yeah.
Right. As you started through your writings, right, you reflect on this, you write a lot about the hardship of the Issei women, and
Yeah.
then your own relationship with your mother began to change through your writings. Can you speak about how that happened?
Yeah, it happened quite late in life. I think she was in her 90s at that time. She died when she was 98, and I think she was about 90 when I went to visit her, and I brought her home to California, and she lived with me in the latter part of her life. And I remember one day she was talking about, right, kind of bitterly, about my dad's infidelity, about the mistress that he had. And I remember telling her, "Oh my God, Mom, that was just that's so long ago, why are you still why are you still thinking about that or even hanging on to that memory?" And my mother said, "Well, それは大事な問題だから、daiji is translated to be maybe important or serious, a very serious matter." that's something that she just never forgave him for, you know, and it was very, very hurtful. And I remember for the first time, and then by that time I was married and had children of my own. And I realized, and my view of my dad, I've always admired my dad for being, you know, and he was so well read. We used to discuss poetry and literature a lot, and I got along with my, you know, it was something. I think I have a poem about this, that
Mhm.
he kind of stood between my mother and me
Mhm.
for many years, you know, because I always admired and loved my dad. I thought more than I did, and I felt kind of a distance from my mother, and I really didn't become very close to her until after my dad died, which is kind of too bad, you know.
Mhm. Yes. I want to ask about, you know, your two essays in This Bridge Called My Back, right? I would say put you on the national map. That's when you became really known as an Asian American feminist writer.
Yeah.
And this is the 1970s, the early 1980s. I'm wondering if at that time you had a sense that you were helping to build what Sheila Sandoval calls the US Third World feminist movement.
No, not at all. I think that I was just writing um, about my situation as an Asian American woman, and I remember, I don't remember exactly what that was in response to, but there were two essays that I had already written,
Mhm.
and when they asked me if I had anything, you know, that I submitted it, and they put it in that book. Yeah.
Well, that one that you wrote, Invisibility is an Unnatural Disaster, right?
That was written way back, like in the 1960s, but it's kind of depressing that it's still relevant when you're talking about
Still
the fact
so
that
relevant.
I know that you would think that after all these years that somehow things
Mhm.
might have changed, but they
Mhm.
haven't really. Yeah.
I want to shift to your activism a little. And you did a lot of work with Amnesty International, right? And you were on the board of USA Amnesty. And what Amnesty you were charged with was writing and supporting prisoners of conscience throughout the world,
Yeah. Well,
right?
Amnesty International had a policy that you couldn't work in your own country. You could not work in prisoners in your own country. And that was to protect their members who, in other parts of the world, where they might have gotten into trouble by working on maybe prisoners of conscience, and that their own government was, you know, abusing prisoners of conscience or whatever, and they would get in trouble with their own government, right?
Mhm.
And so their policy was that you couldn't work in your own country. So when Mike was doing was um, and so when I left, while I was a member of the board, uh, I told him that I couldn't do that. And
Mhm.
so after my board, I think I was served for 2 terms, and then the 1990s, when my term was up, then that was when I started working with Mike, with his prisoner. And the difference was that the work that I was doing with Amnesty International was much more, um, well, I didn't know the prisoners, you
Mhm.
know, it was kind of a distant thing. But with the political prisoners, Mike's political prisoners, I became very close friends with the prisoners. I visited them in the prisons, and out here in Southern California, as well as in it was near it was about an hour from Oakland.
Right.
It
In
was
Dublin.
in Dublin, yeah,
Mhm.
Dublin, right. And so um so there was much more you know, we're much more personal. I became very, very close friends with Marilyn Buck and Carmen Valentin, you know, the women that I got to know them quite close as personal friends. And so
Mhm.
yeah, that made a big difference, I think. Yeah.
Yeah, I was going to ask you some about what the difference was when I know your brother, right, Mike Yasutake, was urging you to visit US held political prisoners. Of course, well, also supporting political prisoners throughout the world, but also wanting to bring you closer to home. And then you chose to visit the women, and then several of them were poets. And
Yeah,
so,
Marilyn Buck. Yeah.
yeah, Marilyn Buck. Can you speak about Marilyn Buck and this very special relationship? Because I will say these women political prisoners had the greatest respect and admiration for you, Mitsu.
Yeah, well, yes, we became very close personal friends. We exchanged writings, and I tried, I helped them publish their works when they did I encouraged them to write about their thing. And then I, of course, had that program to publicize their writings. I encouraged them to write about their own lives. And I was teaching creative writing, at Cypress College. And so it was something that I kind of did quite naturally when I went to visit them personally. I would help them write about their own lives and write their many of them said, "Oh, well, I don't really know how." Well, just write about like the way that you might write in your diary, or to about your daily your lives, or what you're doing in prison and what life is like and so forth. And so that was how it started. Yeah.
Mhm. There was such a wonderful set of programs. I think it was In Their Own Words.
In their own words. Yeah.
Right. And in the mid-90s, you really brought together your kind of literary circles with your political activism circles, and you had your women, mostly women of color, many Asian American women writers and poets
Yang
reading.
Huang and Nuro Wu came help me. They did the reading, I think, and I did a reading. We did a reading in San Francisco, and Tilly Olson came and helped me. We all read the works of the political prisoners. It was called In Their Own Words because it was we read the works of the political prisoners. Yeah.
Yeah, it was beautiful. Yeah, and in LA, I think it was Karen Yamashita and Valina Hasu Houston who read. And you
Yeah.
even did one at Santa Barbara where it was just regular folks reading.
Yeah. Or the students read. The
Yes,
students were
yes,
reading.
yes, yes.
So, yeah.
I want to turn to the current moment, right? This is just an extraordinary moment, right, of polarization, right, of intensive attacks on um, people of color communities, poor communities, undocumented communities, trans communities, and also this unprecedented moment of, well, yeah, I think it is, of resistance, right? We've had many examples of resistance. You and your brother, right, Mike Yasutake, are examples of this long history of activist resistance. And I'm wondering what you think about the current moment. Like, I want to ask a multi-part question. How would you analyze what's happening? What do you think are the most urgent tasks that we do? How do
I
you
think
think?
it's still the most urgent issue is racism. I think that this is one of the things that Mike used to say, that was the racism of the most virulent forms of racism in this country needs to be addressed, that we don't really address very, even when I was on the board of Amnesty International, I think that when you bring it up in the media, you bring the word racism was quite hurtful for a lot of white people in this country. They hated to be called a racist, right? When somebody is talking of, like maybe one of my colleagues at my college, we would be talking about something and about the Vietnamese or whatever, and they would. I think that one of the faculty members said something like, "Well, you know how those people are," and just like a side comment as he's talking. And I think that normally I used to, when people made racist comments or kind of veiled racist comments, I wouldn't just let it go, right? I mean, why you don't want to do, I mean, besides, it was beside the point of what was going on in the conversation. But then I think I learned that you have to address it immediately. And I remember at that point I said, no, I really don't know what they, what are, I mean, that sounds kind of racist to me. And they become very offended because they, like very liberal people, don't think of themselves as being racist. And it's a kind of a very hurtful thing to say to people. And we said, well, I'm not, they said, well, you're calling me a racist. No, I'm not calling you a racist. I just said that what you said just now was a racist comment.
Mhm.
And I think that needs to, we need to do that more, I think.
Yeah.
And we don't. And
Mhm.
even to this day, right? When you're having just a regular, in a party or a social setting, somebody makes a comment, you don't kind of interject and say, well, that is a racist. You don't do that because you think it's very disrespectful. It doesn't,
Mhm.
and that, it really is not a good thing to do in a social setting. But I think you really have to do that, because you have to, it makes people think a little bit. Yeah. I think that Mike was right. That is the most important issue today, that we all need to confront it, to face it, and to try to and we need to do it within our own circles, within our family, and then into our lower, maybe an immediate social circle.
Mhm.
And I think this is something that we have to be aware of.
So I want to end with one final question. You have lived across 10 decades. You've seen a lot of change. You've been engaged in a lot of
I'm
struggle.
97 years old now.
And just looking so beautiful.
I'm approaching 100.
I know. I hope I'm like you when I'm 100. I'm wondering if you have anything that you would like to say to young people from the wisdom of your almost 100 years of walking this earth.
I think that being yourself is the most important. Being really true to yourself is the most important thing. I think that when I was even in graduate school at University of Chicago, we were the kind of writing that we did, I wrote sonnets that had nothing to do with what was going on in my own life. It was something totally remote and abstract about, abstract comments or intellectual exercise of some sort that is so alien to yourself, And I think that the young writers really, I think that the thing that when I started to, that was in the late 1960s, when I first read my friend, Alta, who was the founder of the Shameless Hussy Press that published my camp notes the first time. I read a poem by her, and some of the poems that she wrote, and Marge Piercy, some of the women writers, very, very angry women writers. And they just blew me away. I just realized how much the poems really came out of their gut, they were just completely out of their hearts. And I had never been taught that in high school, or all throughout my, when you did writing, you wrote, and it was like being in polite society. You didn't see certain things. And so it's really important to be yourself and to be completely honest with yourself, in writing. Yeah.
I think that we can end now the interview because it's been more than 20 minutes, if you're okay with that, Mitsu.
Sure. Yeah.
Okay.
Sure. Okay. So, and thank you for the Nisei Radicals. It's just wonderful. I mean, I'm really glad that you did it.
What an honor, right? To get to write about you and Mike and to learn
Yeah,
more about you.
I'm really glad that you know, Mike's story needs to be told because he was an amazing human being. It was just amazing what he did. And I thank you for that, which is really great.
He really was. Yes, yes.
Well, hello. That was such a wonderful interview. I guess I'd like to start out by saying that there's an amazing number of activists and writers in the audience. Among them, Nellie Wong. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about the movie, Nellie and Mitsuye, that I'm trying to remember what year it came out, but it's one of the ones that I think is still shown a lot in women's studies and also uh, many kinds of film festivals. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yes. I wish that this wasn't Zoom so that Nellie
Yeah.
and Mitsu could just come on and speak, but because it's Zoom, I know you're addressing this to me. And hi, Nellie. Um, yeah, that film, Mitsu and Nellie, was really formative to me, right? As someone searching for alternative images of Asian American women and Asian American feminists. And it's just this wonderful film that shows their friendship, their differences in politics, but the ways that their writings really help to ground them as women at that time, and Asian women, right, at that time. I remember a couple of scenes that really stand out for me. One is where Mitsu is at Minidoka with her two daughters, Jenny and Hetty, and they're talking, and they suddenly realize the ways that Mitsu tried to shield them from racism all that time. And it's
Mm.
just a tear. I mean, there's like tears
Mhm.
flowing, and it's just this really tender moment. And then there's another moment I remember with Nellie Wong and her many brothers, sisters, and one brother, and they're having dinner at the table, and they're recognizing the kind of sexism that exists within Chinese American culture and families.
I also want to say, my gosh, Karen Ishizuka's here and Elaine Ikomoko, and also some younger scholars like Mira Shimabukuro. Chizu Omori is also here, another contemporary of Mitsu's from Seattle. And so anyway, and to everyone else that I'm seeing here, like Greg Robinson and Frank Abe and Ken Mochizuki and everyone else, thank you so much for coming. So I think I'm going to go to the Q&A here. And there's a question about the original edition of Camp Notes. And did you say this was the first book of poetry by a Japanese American woman on the incarceration? Is that
That is my
okay?
understanding. Exactly.
Okay,
Writing about the experiences of the camps, right? Because
right.
people were, there was, well, anyways, I don't know if that's your question or if there's another question in there. Mhm.
Oh, no, that, and also I think there's another question about how was the book received when it was released? How was it received by the Japanese American community, the greater community? So,
Yeah. Yeah. So I don't know if you can see this. This is it. And this is it in the original form. And it's quite a
mhm.
slim book. There's Mitsu on the back. But
It's a great picture.
yeah, and just these really wonderful poems in here. Like one of my favorites, well, there's so many, but one of them is Cincinnati, where she writes about what it was like to be, this is where she went right after leaving the camps, you know, when people said yes, yes to the loyalty questions, they could leave for college or military service. She followed Mike to Cincinnati, where he was enrolled at the University of Cincinnati. She thought she couldn't get in. She was just going to work in the cafeteria or someplace, but the dean of the women helped her to get enrolled. But while she was there, she talks about what it was like to have somebody spit on her and how hard that was and how she locked those feelings up inside of her and didn't talk about that for years, right? And that was so symbolic, right? For she's reflecting on her own experiences, but thinking about what this meant for the Japanese American community. And so I think that Camp Notes, as I'm understanding, was received in different ways, right? So
Mhm.
from those who were trying to speak out at this time to raise their voice for redress and reparations, right? The feminist circles really saw this as an important book. And then Mitsu also tells a story of speaking. I think this was the JACL meeting in Chicago, probably Mike helped to get it. And a man spoke to her and was like, why do you associate with Chinese Americans, and why don't you just do things for Japanese Americans only? And she was so angry.
Mm.
And so there continues to be tensions, but they were even greater at that time, right? Karen, while you're announcing who's in this audience, which is pretty amazing, I also want
Mhm.
to give a shout out to Linda Evans, who's one of the political
Yes.
prisoners that Mitsu former political prisoners who Mitsu visited in Dublin. And I don't even know who else, because I could only see if you wrote in the chat or if you're,
Mhm.
I can't see anybody. And I also want to note that Dora Garcia and Ron Fujiyoshi are in here, are here, and they're part of this book. And Mike Backham, I really want to give a shout out, amazing editor at the University of Washington Press. Thank you, Mike.
So here's another question. The white power structure is determined to hold on to its dominance by any means necessary. They've been more than willing to assassinate any and all threats to that dominance, as we've seen as Martin Luther King Jr. and Fred Hampton were gaining ground in forming cross-racial alliances. Where do you see such alliances necessary for any change to the prevailing racist power structures going from here in the face of lethal hostility from the dominant culture?
Yeah, there's a lot in this question, right? I think that what is happening at this moment is that, right, the white power structure is greatly threatened by demographics, the numerics of people of color rising in the United States, and also by the shifts in power, the ways that many segments of the society are saying that we need to attend to racial justice. How deep this goes is open to question and discussion. But there is, from corporate America to the grassroots, right? Saying the NBA has BLM on the court side, right? And this is a huge threat. And so we're seeing an increasing polarization in the United States at this moment along racial fault lines. And as the white power structure sees itself losing ground, it is moving increasingly towards fascism. So it's not just able to use hegemonic culture, narratives, discourse to maintain a certain type of control, or what Noam Chomsky talks about as our consent, right, to being governed in this way, but also needing to turn more and more to outright fascism. And we're not under a fascist state, but there's a rise in this, and we need to always be vigilant about this. And fascism also often works along racial lines. And we need to think about the ways that racism is intertwined with capitalism, is intertwined with ecological destruction, is intertwined with heteropatriarchy. And that's why it's so important to be fighting on multiple fronts.
And this is, I think, a related question. And this has to do with the intersection of activism. Did Mitze interact with indigenous movements? Was she active with them? And so there's a reference in Desert Run, and that made the writer curious, I think, about any kind of activism that she might be involved in or might have been involved in.
Yeah, that's a really good question. And certainly in working in the US third world feminist movement, right? And for example, on this
Mhm.
bridge called My Back, that really was about connecting at that times the ways people were thinking about Black, Chicana, Indigenous, and Asian American uh, feminists, many queer feminists, right?
Mhm.
uh, at that time. And Desert Run is just, her second set of poetry is wonderful. And it has, uh, she speaks about the importance of the desert, how when she was in Minidoka, she couldn't see or hear the silent beauty of the desert, right?
Mhm.
It was just sand and wind and scorpions. And but then when she was teaching at the community college, her office mate was a biologist and would
Oh.
always be going to the desert and would bring back snakes to show her class and then would drive back to the desert to release the snakes. And Mitsu would accompany her. And she learned through her colleague to really listen and see what was in the desert and the silence of the desert and the beauty of the desert. And I feel like it was such a beautiful metaphor for um, kind of Mitsu, for the ways that she writes. She has this kind of Japanese aesthetic that is very understated. And
Mhm.
the ways that she's both trying to break silence, but not in a loud way. And also recognizing the ways that silence matters, right? That it's saying
Mhm.
more. Like people think of it as nothingness or emptiness, but that's not what it is. And Mitsu is somebody who can bring that out in her writings. And yeah, she brings it alive. And I just want to say that in um, Nisei Radicals, the book opens with a poem by Brin Saito that looks at Mitsu's Desert Run and speaks back to it as assuming a yonsei, right? And it's just beautiful.
I think Bryn may actually be here too. So
Oh,
thank you for that work.
mhm.
Let's see. So Patricia is wondering, is it true if you're working on a book about Nisei for Wallace Nisei progressives, both East Coast and West Coast branches?
Hmm.
And I don't know about that. So can you speak to that or?
Thank you for the question. I didn't catch who it was from, so I don't even
Yeah,
know if you were part of the Nisei Progressives or.
yeah, it's Patricia Wakida.
Oh, hi, Patricia. Yes,
Hmm.
yes. So the Nisei Progressives were organization of Japanese American, right? Nisei, second generation, mostly born between 1910 and 1940, who in the immediate post-war years um, organized to fight for progressive causes at a time when Japanese Americans were coming out of the war, trying not to make waves because when you're deemed the enemy and now you're able to fit in and now you're having some more positive representations, there's a understandable way people didn't want to speak out. But there were amazing people like Sue Kunitomi Embury and Shizu Iyama and others. And the Nisei Progressives formed first as Nisei for Wallace, fighting for a third party progressive candidate, right, of the Progressive Party, Henry Wallace, in 1948. And when
Mm.
he didn't win, obviously, for the US presidency, they transformed into the Nisei Progressives. They were in New York, Chicago, and Los Angeles. And they did things like actually opposed the McCarran-Walter Act, which granted citizenship to the Issei, naturalized citizenship, which was crucial to overturning hundreds of laws based on the status of immigration, aliens ineligible to citizenship. And of course, they wanted citizenship, but that law was both anti-Black, it was anti-Asian in its racism, and it was anti-left. And they said, we are not, this is deep solidarities as I talk about. They were not going to accept this for the Japanese American community on the backs of others. And I will say, if you're interested, I have two articles published on the Nisei Progressives, one in the Journal of Asian American Studies and the second in the Pacific Historical Review. And yes, these will form two chapters, my current book on early Cold War Japanese American activism, the current project I'm working on.
It's wonderful. So Mitsu is listening in with her granddaughter, Hetty, and she wanted to say that she read, goes back to the question about alignment with Indigenous people. She said she read a lot with Indigenous poets, and certainly poets like Christos were in This Bridge Called My Back, but not a lot of joint activism. I'm wondering, we haven't talked very much about Michael Yasutake, and I wonder if you could speak a little bit about him. He died about 20 years ago, I think, sadly, and so, but I was so inspired by what you wrote about. I mean, he was a conscientious objector, right? And
Mhm.
yeah, and he worked for political prisoners. And can you talk a little bit about how his faith, what you found out about his faith and how that informed his activism?
Mhm. Yes, Mike Yasutake is an incredible person. I wish Mitsu could be here on this program because she
Mhm.
has a million stories and so admires her brother, and he helped her to deepen her own politics. He was just relentless, nonstop, lost jobs because of his activism, had a sense of ethics and duty, which I think were related to his Christian beliefs about what you're supposed to be doing. And it doesn't matter whether you're popular or liked or get into trouble. You do what you're supposed to do. So during World War II, when he was at the University of Cincinnati, they came back and asked him about whether he would serve in the military. He again said no, and got kicked out of the university where there was some military research happening. During the 60s, after he became an Episcopal priest, he was working in college ministries for the Episcopal Church, and he was going to colleges, but then on his own, he interpreted college ministries as extending to young people who were resisting the draft. So he would travel
Mhm.
hundreds of miles. I have this amazing 10-page document documenting a 10-day trip that he did, and he would travel hundreds of miles to visit stockades and federal penitentiaries to try to try to visit people. And sometimes he mostly had failures. He mostly never got to visit, but then sometimes he did. But it was really important for him to redefine what college ministries is. And then in 1980, he had been working with Carmen Valentin, one of the former political prisoners, and she got arrested as part of 11 people who were Puerto Rican revolutionaries
Mhm.
fighting for national liberation of Puerto Rico.
Mhm.
They got arrested in Evanston, this was right after the Iran hostage crisis, mistaken for Iranian terrorists. These tropes
Ah.
really
Oh
last.
dear.
And he went and visited them, and that deepened, they were already doing activism, but that deepened his support for both their struggle, which they believed in armed self-defense, and he was a pacifist, but
Mhm.
so they had different politics, they respected their differences, but he uh, believed in the United Nations declarations that supported um, struggles against colonial occupation. And so he fully supported them. And so he was just this amazing person. And at the end of his life was engaging in these Tochiwa Inochi Land is Life programs, where they were looking at the ongoing impacts of World War II and of US and Japanese militarism on the people of Okinawa, right, who endured the Battle
Mhm.
of Okinawa at the end of World War II, right, which killed a quarter of the Okinawan population by the US military and Japanese military. And Marshall Island women who, as a result of nuclear testing, their babies were born, right? They
Mhm.
called them jellyfish babies. And so they had all this kind of testimony. And so he really had grown into an anti-imperialist activist. And just, like I said, relentless in his work. And in his support for political prisoners, constant.
Mhm.
He was actually, when he died, he was at Christmas time in 2001, visiting his son and family in Ohio. He lives in Evanston, Illinois, and he was going to visit Mumia Abu-Jamal, the
Mhm.
political prisoner in Pennsylvania, on his way home to Chicago, which if you follow that, it's not on the way home, but this was just part of his constant commitments. Mhm.
Well, I think we're at the end of questions and time, but I just wanted to bring us back to our current situation, the horrific shootings in Atlanta, and to see what you might. I know that you've been commenting recently in the media about that, but I'm wondering what you've learned maybe from your research, both for this book and also, the other research that you've been doing into activism, and what maybe what advice you might give us at this point um, in our
Yes.
response to
So
that.
there's so much that's happening, right, with Atlanta and the rise in anti-Asian violence.
Mhm.
I think it's important that we speak to the problems happening, right, the racism against Asian Americans, but always have in mind how impacts are impacting Indigenous communities and Black communities as well, right? So
Mhm.
careful, right? The need to keep Asian American communities safe, but also, do we then call for the police, or do we fight for other kinds of mechanisms, like there are bystander trainings and other kinds of responses, reporting, right, to stop AAPI hate, or looking at the Asian Americans Advancing Justice website, which has a lot of resources. I want to say that we have to recognize that what is happening, say, in Atlanta,
Mhm.
is a long history of course, anti-Asian racism and violence, but it's intricately connected to US militarism abroad. When you have camp towns, right, with Korean women providing sexual services to US military, right? These camp towns arose around the US military bases all throughout Asia. So a colleague at the University of Hawaii, Laurel, made a comment of a slogan she heard, and I just heard her speak this today, and she said, if the slogan of the Black Lives Matter is police violence, right, then the analysis for Asian American activism ought to be military violence in opposition to military violence. I think that keeps in mind the kind of work Mike and Mitsu were doing
Mhm.
on a global scale, and helps us to move away from thinking only about individual instances of violence, right, which have huge impacts, right, on families and communities, but to moving to systems that are violent. So how can we only look at violence happening by individuals against individuals when we have a greater context of police violence against communities and military violence against communities abroad? And what are we going to be doing to intervene in all of these very difficult issues?
Well, thank you very much. You've given us a lot to think about. There's lots of work to do, and let's do it in honor of Mitsu's work and in honor of Michael's work and everyone else here. So Nisei Radicals, it's a wonderful book. I encourage everyone to read it. Thank you so much for spending time with us today, Diane, and Mitsu also, and Hedy, and everyone that has attended. Thank you and
My
good night.
gratitude to Mitsu and Mike, to you, and to everyone in the audience, and to Densho. Thank
Yeah,
you.
thank you, Densho.
Yeah, there's important work to do. Let's get busy.
So go to densho.org and find out more about it. And we'll see you soon.